Hello and welcome to my Game Art Actors video submission. This video will showcase the work from this module over a number of weeks. The main task for the module was to create a player character using a number of different techniques and softwares with the end goal of having a playable character in Unreal Engine. The first step was to build a basic bipedal character. This will be done in Maya based on a character sheet provided by the lecturer. Here is a turnaround of the finished bipedal character in Maya. Here is a breakdown on how the model was created. Firstly, the character reference sheet was placed onto image planes, which were moved and rotated to be in line with the 0 axes, as well as to show the side view when the camera is facing left or right, and the front view when the camera is facing forward or backwards. This is done to help with getting the character body parts the correct size and proportions when creating the model. Once this is in place, the modelling can begin. Starting with a spear for the head and a cube for the torso, using the soft selection tool with certain vertices selected, a basic head shape was made following the character sheet, which will be refined later. After this, divisions were added to the cube and vertices were moved to create the shape of the torso, again matching the character sheet. Knowing the symmetry tool can be used later, a focus on the left side of the body was the next step, creating the arm, hand and fingers. Extruding from the shoulder of the torso, a number of extrusions were made following the shape and size of the character sheet. This was done down to the point where the fingers and thumb start, and to create the thumb, the face that was matching the reference was selected, and from that a number of extrusions were used to create the shape and size of the thumb. For the fingers, the multi-cut tool was used a number of times, and with the new faces made, the extrusion tool was used, but with the settings keep faces together turned off. That way the fingers are able to have gaps between them. And again, extrusions were made and shaped to create the rest of the shape of the fingers. The same process was used for the legs and feet, extruding from the hip using the tool a number of times matching the reference. The multi-cut tool was used a number of times to create more edge loops through the torso. This was done to get a more rounded look through the shape of the legs. For this model, the toes were made as one. This was done because they won't be animated like the fingers, but the detail will be added down the line with sculpting and the texturing. So from the bottom of the leg, a number of extrusions were made and shaped to create the shape of the feet. Part of the torso without the arms and legs was then deleted, and then the model was mirrored to have both arms and legs in place. Next was to shape the head better by moving vertices and deleting parts of the mesh so it would fit the reference and also connect to the neck by matching the topology of the torso. Once the two parts were in place, the body and the head were combined, and any overlapping vertices or ones that were close together were combined using the merge to center tool. The mesh was then smoothed a number of times to get a high poly version, so it's ready for the sculpting stage, which will be done in ZBrush. Before the sculpting, reference on human anatomy was gathered. With this being a first for creating and sculpting a character, it was important to gather as much reference as possible to help with the sculpting process. A mix of reference images was gathered showing things like muscle groups, details on the face, hands and feet, as well as the differences between male and female. Examples of stylized characters were also gathered, which replicate the shape of the model a bit better, and some general alien examples to also help with referencing. With this all in place, it was time to now sculpt, which will be done in ZBrush. The sculpting will begin with the block out of the build up of the muscle groups. Unfortunately, due to PC specs, the recording feature in ZBrush was unable to be used, but here is the block out version of the model in ZBrush. And the process used for this was, firstly, the mesh was subdivided a few times to get a higher poly count. Then using the move brush with the mask tool, areas of the mesh were moved and shaped better. Areas like the shoulders were given a lot more better shape and more rounded. And the legs were reshaped to not make them as wide as they were. Then again with the mask tool, muscle groups were sectioned off, and using the clay build-up / tube brush, muscle definition were sculpted in throughout the model. For the hands and feet, more build-up was used to define these areas, so more build-up in the areas such as the knuckles and nails, and a lot more build-up around the neck and head area. adding definition to the jawline, cheeks and the nose. Then the mask tool was used to create the eye area, and with the subtract tool with the clay build-up tool, the eye sockets were created. The symmetry tool would be used throughout this process, meaning both sides of the body will be the same. With the blocker and build-up in place, smoothing now will take place to get rid of the clay build-up lines throughout the mesh. Again, with the mask tool using the muscle groups, the smooth brush would be used over the groups to smooth out the sort of clay build-up lines which can be seen throughout the model. And then any areas that needed a little bit more work, the standard clay tool will be used to build up those areas, then go over again with the smooth tool. After the smoothing, the dam standard tool would be used. This is used to give back any sort of details that have been smoothed away in areas where there should be a little bit more definition to the mesh. Eyes were then added to the model, and the next step for the character is the UV in ZBrush and the basic paintwork. For the UV, firstly the C remesher tool was used for the mesh, which makes the model a lower poly model, which will be used later in Maya, and to also make a easier UV in ZBrush. To create the UV, using the select lasso tool, the head, torso, 2 arms, 2 hands, 2 legs and the 2 feet were selected and then made into polygroups. These UVs would be then unwrapped and morphed into a UV map, ready for the basic paint job. Before the painting, more reference images were gathered, this time focusing on subdermal colouring and the colour ideas for the alien creature. This will be used to build up the colours underneath the skin, but will show through the base colour of the model. Areas such as the mouth, eyes, nose and the hands and feet all have different colour tones, and if this is applied to this model it will get a more realistic look to it. After the referencing was gathered, it was onto painting in ZBrush. Again, due to PC issues, no recording of the process was made, but here is a turnaround of the basic paint job with the subdermal colouring on the model. Following the reference images, a yellow undercolour was added for the neutral parts of the skin. Then using the RGB brush with an alpha texture applied, using colours like reds, blues, purples and some greens, areas of the body were built up in colour, matching the subdermal colouring reference images. Once all these colours were in place, the smooth tool was used to blend all the colours together, and this process was repeated a number of times. Then a purple base colour was picked and applied a number of times with a low intensity. This was to add the skin colour but still show the subdermal colour zones underneath the skin. This paint job is more of a pre-texture for the model. It will be taken into Substance Painter to be painted further and more detail added to the model. But for now, this is a good baseline for the texture. Next, the model was exported as an FBX and added to Maya to create a low poly retop. To make the model game ready, a retop of the model needs to be done. This is because the game model at the moment is too high poly for the game engine and needs to be much lower poly to run well within Unreal. The high poly version will still be used for normal maps and baking, but for now it will just be turned into a live service, so the quad draw tool can be used on it to make the low poly retop. Quads were added to the live service to make the low poly model, starting with the head as this is the most detailed part of the model. Adding a number of quads starting with the eye area, keeping the amount of quads equal throughout the eye, and also using the symmetry tool so the other half would look the same. Building out from the eye, slowly making the quads bigger in size where there is less detail on the model, then eventually adding some tries to the model. This way in the less detailed areas of the model, the quads can be bigger and have less of them in those parts. Continuing down to the torso and into the arms and legs, where there was more quads that were needed to be added for more details. Tries again were added, but this time the other way around, so more quads can be added. For the fingers, tries were added to the model to create the gap between the fingers. Then the quad building continued for the rest of the fingers following the live mesh. Same process was applied through to the feet, but this time the tries were used for detail instead of the gaps in the toes. Edge loops were added where necessary for more detailed areas or areas that will bend, such as the elbows and knees. The relax tool was used throughout the model. This was used to give the quads a more even look. The mesh was then smoothed and conformed to give it a more detail and to match the shape of the high poly version. Doing this retop, it has made the original mesh have 90% less poly count and is still able to get a good amount of detail in the model. Next was to UV the low poly version of the mesh by adding a planar UV to the model and then using the 3D cut and sew UV tool, which was used to create the UV shells, which were made to make cuts around the neck, shoulder, wrist, legs and feet. After this, the UV shells were unfolded and placed onto one UV island. A retop for the eye was also made, and this was attached and combined to the model and also added to the UV island. Next was to add a rig system to the model. Using the quick rig tool in Maya, adding 3 spine, 2 neck and 1 shoulder guides for the control points. Then adding this guide to the mesh, and once the control points were added, movements to the certain points like the elbow, shoulder and the leg points were moved to fit where they are on the model. This was done by using the front, top and side view for guidance, as well as the mirror tool to get the symmetry on both sides of the model. Once all the points were in place, a skeleton rig was created and attached to the mesh via skinning. Now the mesh can be moved around with the joints of the rig with help with the kinematics that have been added by Maya. There are some issues with this when moving the rig around, as the weight painting for the rig isn't a clean bind, meaning when there is movement with the rig, some of the mesh is deformed. This can be fixed by adjusting the weight painting on the model, going through all the key bones of the mesh, using Maya's weight paint tool. The influence was adjusted throughout the body to make a clean bind to the rig. A lot of trial and error was used during this process, changing the weights for each of the bones, then moving / rotating the bones to see how they affect the mesh, and this was time consuming due to the difficulties of using weight painting and the first time using it. Here are some examples of the weights and the bone movements within them. Now the rig and weighting is done, it was time to add animation, add the model to Unreal Engine. But before that, an update to the texture was done in Substance Painter. Adding the low poly version of the model and using the high poly version for the bake. Then adding the base color texture from ZBrush, work on improving the texture would begin. Following a YouTube guide on how to make better skin, a number of layers were added to create more detail throughout the model and to make the skin look more realistic. The subdermal colour stones also got some work, especially in the face area to bring out this sculpted detail more. And once the texturing was done, the texture files were exported as well as the mesh ready to be added to Mixamo. The model was added to Mixamo and the auto rig was set up with the points provided. Once the rig and weighting was configured, it was time to select the animations. For this character, it will be using the third person player controller in the Unreal Engine, meaning the user will be able to see the player character in third person and there will be movement to the character. So movement animations need to be added to the model we have created. Any normal game character will have at least 3 animation states for the movement. These are hold for when the character is stationary, walk for when the character is walking, and run for when the character is running. So these 3 states will be used and downloaded from Mixamo. For the hold animation, a pose with the feet together will be used. This will be used because it will make the animation easier to blend between the different states. And if a pose with the feet separately was used, the blend between the walk and hold animation will look out of place. For the walk and run animation, using animations from the same pack will help blend in. So the unarmed walk and run animation was picked. Adjusting the overdrive and character arm space, which changes the speed of the animation and the positioning of the arms, which was done to have more fitting movement for the size and the scales of the limbs. Once the animations were picked, they were downloaded with the old animation having the mesh attached for use in Unreal. In Unreal, a new third-person scene was set up, and all the files associated with the character were added to the game, as well as the textures and material setup. Blend space was made with the imported animations, as well as an animation blueprint. The third-person player character was changed to have the new character attached, as well as the movement animations. A sprint function was added to the player input, so the walk speed can transition to the sprint speed, as well as the animation. Here is the main character moving in the scene with the animations attached. Overall, I'm happy with the outcome of the character I have created. Working in Maya is something I feel very comfortable with now. I have vast amounts of experience with the software, so modelling, retopping and UVs I feel very comfortable with doing. But I always find myself learning something new with the software, such as the UV drag cut tool. I found the tool extremely useful when creating the UVs, and will definitely be using this tool going forward, as UVs are generally quite a time consuming task, so a tool like this will speed up the workflow. ZBrush, although very daunting at first, over time I became more accustomed to the software. I now realise why the software is used so much within the industry and how powerful it is for game artists. And now that I have used ZBrush, I will continue to use it going forward, using it for future work and start to use it for prop/environment art. Sculpting and working with human anatomy I found difficult at times. It's not something I've done before, and my knowledge on the human anatomy is limited. This led to me to spending a lot of time on this sculpting stage, starting parts over and going over them a number of times, which even led me to starting the sculpting process again. Ultimately, I was happy with the decision I've made of starting again because I made a better quality model. But if I was to do this project again, I would put more research into human anatomy, as well as have a more focused reference board, instead of having a bunch of referencing, which I feel made my task more challenging. With animation, I feel I have a good enough understanding on what works well for a character. I understand the importance of having realistic animations for the character, as out of place animations or unblended ones can ruin the feel and look for the character and the game. Like mentioned before, I am overall happy with the outcome of the project. I feel I have made a playable game character which I could see being used in a game as the playable character or as an NPC. I hope you enjoyed this video and thank you for watching.